Hi there, it's Miss DePoy here, and today I'm reading from the Egypt Game, Chapter 12, Elizabethan Diplomacy. When the shapeless, inhuman figure sprang into the middle of the storage yard, the four Egyptians could only clutch each other in panic, too shocked for the moment to even scream. April had just managed to get her mouth open to yell for help when suddenly Marshall pointed and said, "Look!" A second figure was appearing over the top of the fence. This second invader, who was having some difficulty climbing over the wire at the top of the fence, had a strangely angular look about him. Strangely angular and strangely familiar. In all four Egyptians, frozen fear boiled at once into a choking mixture of anger and relief. In April, it overflowed into stuttering sputter. You dirty finks, she yelled. On top of the fence, Toby finally managed to get his boxy legs free of the barbed wire. He jumped down, losing his TV head in the process. Then, as the four badly shaken Egyptians turned loose of each other and tried to regain their dignity, the monster and the box man leaned on each other and choked with fiendish laughter. They laughed, leaning on each other and standing up, bending over as if they were in pain, and finally collapsed, sitting flat on the ground. Then, while the four members of the Egypt gang stared at them in helpless, fuming anger, they just sat there, leaning against each other's backs, still shaking with gradually weakening seizures. "Man, oh man," Toby gasped finally. "I gotta quit laughing. My stomach's killing me." "Sheesh, me too," Ken said. "I'm dying." Ken fell over backwards and just lay there, holding his stomach and saying, "Sheesh," weakly from time to time. But Toby crossed his legs and leaned forward with his chin on one hand and stared at the angry Egyptians. "Hey, February," he said finally, "how do you say panic button in Egyptian?" April clenched her fists and took a step forward. Toby started to scramble to his feet. He'd seen April in action before. But Melanie and Elizabeth grabbed her and held her back. "Turn loose," April said. "I'm going to punch him in the nose." "There's no use doing that," Melanie whispered. "That won't do any good. We can't keep them from telling on us by punching them in the nose." After a moment's consideration, April nodded. "Okay, turn loose. I won't punch them. At least not till we find out what they're going to do." She unclenched her fist, and all three girls approached the enemy. Left behind, Marshall sat down on the edge of the temple floor in a good position to watch everything that might happen. Both the boys were standing now, watching the girls warily. "Well," Melanie began, "are you going to tell on us or not?" "Tell on you?" Ken said. "What makes you think we do a thing like that?" "Of course not," Toby said. "We don't go around finking on people." The girls glanced at each other in surprised relief. "However," Toby continued, "this is not a matter of plain and simple finking. Letting you Egyptians get away with all this secret stuff just might be considered, like, unpatriotic or something." "Hey, you're right," Ken said. "Maybe we ought to tell the FBI." "Maybe we should. Or maybe we could just make an official report on the whole scene, like for current events tomorrow morning." Toby stalked to the middle of the yard in what was obviously meant to be the Egyptian walk. Then he faced the group, cleared his throat, and in a phony voice he said, "What's happening in Egypt? A very official report by Tobias Oliver, secret agent." Toby was pretty funny, all right, but no one laughed but Ken. April was thinking a horrible thought. If they knew about the Egyptian walk, how much else did they know? Up until then, she'd been thinking the fence was too high to look over, and they couldn't have seen very much while they were scrambling over it. She ran to the loose board and looked out into the alley. When she pulled her head back in, Melanie guessed the awful truth before she heard it. Taking Melanie aside, April whispered, "There are boxes piled up out there. They could have been watching forever. Shall I punch them now?" Melanie shrugged hopelessly. "Go ahead if you want to, but it won't do any good. I think we might as well leave the country or something." Elizabeth had followed Melanie and listened to April's horrible news. Now, all of a sudden, she said, "I have an idea." Both the girls looked surprised. Elizabeth wasn't the kind of person you expect to come up with ideas in an emergency. But the situation was desperate, so April and Melanie listened. When Elizabeth finished whispering, April shook her head gloomily. "It'll never work," she said. "Well, we may as well try it," Melanie said. "It can't make things any worse." The enemy watched cautiously as the girls returned to face them. For a few seconds, April and Melanie couldn't think of a way to get started, and the five of them just stood there staring at each other. Melanie spoke first. "We don't have permission to be here from the professor or our folks or anybody." Toby grinned. "So what else is new?" he said. April's fists clenched, but she forced herself to open them. "We'll be in terrible trouble if you tell on us." she said in as pitiful a voice as she could manage. To her amazement, she noticed that the look the two boys exchanged was just the tiniest bit confused. And Kamad and Alavar were two guys who weren't easy to confuse. Warming to her theme, she went on. We'll probably get beaten and everything. There was no doubt about it. The enemy had faltered for a few moments, but they managed to regroup. We're crying, Ken said. See the tears? Yeah, we'll come to your funerals, Toby said. Just then, Elizabeth pushed her way between April and Melanie. Everyone looked at her in surprise. She probably had never spoken to a sixth-grade boy before in her life, but now she looked as if she meant to. Please, she said in a feathery little voice, please don't tell on us, and we'll let you play too. April cringed. It was such a corny baby thing to say. She had a crazy urge to grab Elizabeth and drag her out of wisecrack range before she got hurt. But seconds passed and nobody pounced. April unsquinched her eyes. Strangely enough, the boys were looking confused again, more confused than ever. Elizabeth was looking shyly hopeful, like an unspanked puppy. Then Ken blinked his eyes like someone coming to after a whack on the head. Come on, Tobe, let's get out of here, he said. And then to no one in particular, maybe we won't think on you guys. You can never tell. Maybe we just won't be in the mood for thinking, huh, Tobe? But Toby only nodded absently. Ken picked up Toby's TV head and jammed it into his hands. Come on, Tobe, he said. We got to get back before my dad misses me. But Toby appeared to be thinking. He nodded again slowly, then walked around the girls to the temple. He looked for a moment at each altar and then around the yard. When he came back, his eyes had a faraway look. Okay, he said. Okay. We don't rat, and we get to join the game. Is it a deal? Join the game? Ken said. This game? Are you kidding? We can make a deal about using the yard for, he paused and glanced around, foursquare, handball, or something. But he caught a glimpse of Toby's face and his voice trailed off. Toby was lit up like a pinball machine. Ken shrugged philosophically. Okay, he said. So we're Egyptians. It figures. From then on, things happened fast. Toby made everybody take a solemn oath not to tell where they'd been, even if they'd been missed and people started asking questions. Then there was a brief crisis over getting Toby out of the yard. He wouldn't fit through the hole in the fence with his boxes on, and the big box the boys had used for climbing over was too big and heavy to throw into the yard. He couldn't take his costume off because he didn't think he could get back into it without his dad's help, and it wouldn't be wise to rejoin the trick-or-treat group in pieces. Finally, he lay down on the ground and had everybody stomp on him, more or less gently, less in the case of April, who was still mad, until the boxes were flattened enough to squeeze through the hole. Afterwards, they tried to square him back up, but he never did look quite the same. As soon as they'd carried off the boxes and the boys had piled up to climb on, they started off after the trick-or-treat group. Fortunately, Ken knew the line of march, and since they didn't stop at any houses, it wasn't too long until they caught up. They even had time to collect a few more treats before it was time to go home. But it would have taken more than a few pieces of cheap candy to console April and Melanie. After they got the two smaller kids uncostumed and sent home, they sat on April's bed and stared at each other gloomily. What are we going to do? April said finally. We just can't play the Egypt game with those boys there. I don't see how we can either, Melanie said. But what else can we do? You know what will happen if we try to keep them out. We can try to play it anyway. Then, if they're just too awful, I guess we'll have to give the whole thing up. It was a terrible thought. For a few minutes, the two girls contemplated the possibility in mournful silence. At last, in a more cheerful voice, Melanie said, Well, at least we don't have to give it up yet, thanks to Elizabeth. If she hadn't had that idea, I'll bet those jerks would have finked on us right away, just for the fun of it. Yeah, April said wonderingly. How about that, Elizabeth? How'd a little kid like that know how to handle those two creeps? I'm pretty good at handling adults and people like that, but boys? Yick. Melanie grinned. You know, it's sort of like what you do in nonviolence. My mom says it's appealing to their better natures. Better natures? Phooey, April said, wrinkling up her nose. And that's the end of today's chapter.